Namaskar. Hello and welcome to yet another edition of Around the World with Pankaj Saran. Since this is our first edition in this year, we wish all our viewers a very happy new year. In today's edition, we are going to talk about our relations with Egypt. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has invited President General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to become the chief guest for the Republic Day celebrations. This gesture is being seen as a revival of our relations with the historic Arab nation. Other than being the oldest civilizations of the world, Egypt and India have many other things in common. We also have many shared interests in the contemporary world. So let's open up this discussion with my colleagues Asha Khosa and Tripti Nath. Ambassador Saran, let me begin by asking you that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has invited President General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as the chief guest for Republic Day celebrations. Now, how do you see this outreach, given the fact that in between, our attention was more focused on the Gulf countries, and while Egypt was trying to sort out its internal crisis, do you see this gesture as a recovery of substantial traditional relations?
Yeah, thank you, Atir, and wish you and all the viewers a very happy new year, all our panelists. Indeed, it's a very significant decision to invite the President of Egypt for the chief guest of the Republic Day. It's the first time in our history since the Republic Day began, so it's very significant. You know, our relations with Egypt have gone through different phases. You are right that in between, Egypt was more involved in its own local, regional issues, and we were also involved in our regional issues. So there was a period in time when we actually were not looking at each other the way we should have. The heydays of the non-aligned movement, when you had Gamal Abdel Nasser, Jawaharlal Nehru, those days went by and they were not replaced by another similar kind of an engagement with Egypt for various reasons. Both, as I said, regional and developments internal to Egypt. If you remember, Egypt was very deeply involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict. In 1978, the Camp David Accords took place. Egypt was the first country in the Arab world to recognize Israel. And earlier, they had been involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict in 1967. They lost huge territory. They lost the war. But in 1978, they decided to make peace with Israel. They were boycotted by the entire Arab world. And subsequently, Egypt was in the forefront of supporting the Palestinians in Israel, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. And in addition, Egypt was also completely immersed in fighting terrorism, fundamentalism, extremism. And the government of, say, President Mubarak, who was president for almost 30 years, was focused only on these issues. So they did not really have time for India or for the rest of Asia. And because of all these preoccupations, we found that they also had an extremely close relationship with the United States and with Europe, and in particular with France. So that was the Egyptian kind of overall foreign policy posture. But of late, Egypt seems to have decided to look eastward, more towards Asia, to China a little bit, and to Russia. And their outreach to India seems to be a part of this decision to diversify their overall geopolitical options.
Right.
Ambassador Saran, how do you see the political evolution of Egypt? As you said, they faced regional challenges and internal challenges also. We have, as Indians, we were quite interested when Nasser was there, and then even, Hosni Mubarak till that time we all remember, reading about that country. But how have the things changed since the new president has come, who was a general earlier and, who was brought to do firefighting, basically. So how will you look at that country's evolution in political terms?
Well, it's very interesting. After Egypt achieved independence from the British, it's had a long history which goes back centuries. But in the contemporary modern era, what we find is after its independence as a nation, it's been basically governed by the army. And so
Yes.
you had Nasser, you've had Sadat, you've had Mubarak, and now you've had Sisi. All of them have been either army officers, or Mubarak was an Air Force officer. And so it's very interesting that this has been the political structure, and therefore the army, the military, and the security agencies, they control and basically run the country. For a brief period, Mohammad Morsi became president.
Yes.
He represented the Muslim Brotherhood, but he didn't succeed, and there was a huge amount of internal turmoil in Egypt, which was basically a face-off between the army and the Muslim Brotherhood and the other radicals. And there was a huge amount of killings of people and violence and domestic political violence. So this is the story of Egypt's political evolution. Secondly, I think, it's 90% Muslim. The Coptic minority has not really been able to flourish as much as it would have liked. But what the Egyptian authorities have done consistently since Nasser is to make sure that Egypt remains a moderate country, Islamic country. And there, even for example, the role of the Al-Azhar University is very, very important. And they have actually been in the forefront of this fight against terrorism and fundamentalism, well before the birth of ISIL and Al-Qaeda. So they were actually in that frontline state situation. So this was broadly, I think, the way that society has evolved.
Ambassador Saran, India and Egypt, two of the world's oldest civilizations and founding members of the non-aligned movement, are marking 75 years of the establishment of diplomatic ties. We've come a long way. How do you see this relationship going forward in a multipolar world?
I think there is potential. I mean, the days of the non-aligned movement are over, but both Egypt and India are very important systemically in their respective regions. Egypt is the largest Arab country in terms of its cultural influence, in terms of its location, which is strategic because it is a bridge between the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and the Red Sea.
Right.
And the Suez Canal is something which Egypt controls, and it earns a huge amount of money for the Egyptian economy. So Egypt straddles both the Arab world and the African world. And it has a huge amount of cultural influence in the Arab world. Mm-hmm. And India, of course, is a rising power whose influence goes well beyond Asia into the rest of the world. So there is potential for Egypt and India to come together to voice the opinions and the positions of the global South, because particularly because of the Ukrainian conflict, both our countries have actually been deeply affected.
Right.
Egypt was one of the largest importers of food grain, and it was importing a huge amount of wheat from Russia and Ukraine. So it's been directly affected. It's been directly affected because of the energy crisis, because of the traffic through the Suez Canal. And Egypt also traditionally had very close relations with Europe and with the United States. So there is a lot that we can actually work upon in the coming days, provided we have both countries and the leaderships and the systems and the business and industry and governments and intellectuals, we decide to look at each other and overcome the obstacles that are coming in the way. And as I said, the fact is that today the Palestinian issue is more or less sidelined. I mean, we do not hear about it as much as we did, say, 10, 20 years ago. And as far as the Egyptian relationship with Israel is concerned, or the Arab-Israeli relationship, today we find that Israel is not as isolated as it was, when Camp David happened. Today, more Arab countries or Gulf countries have normalized relations with Israel. So if there is peace in the Middle East, if Egypt is freed from its immediate preoccupations, then it can play a bigger role on the world stage.
Sure.
And India can also do that.
Yes, taking, as a follow-up to your answers, what do you think? Because Egypt has been a mediator between Israel and Arab relations, And so, do you think that we, as India and Egypt, have shared interests in this direction? We can work together on this.
I think so, because we have a large Muslim population in India. We have historical ties with the Arab world, with the Gulf region, with Iran, and if we can work together with Egypt to reduce tensions in the Middle East, to fight terrorism and fundamentalism, and to create a world order where different civilizations are respected and can flourish, then we will be doing great service to the stability of the international order. Because if you remember, the Middle East has historically been a very hotly contested area of the world, where it has seen a lot of violence, and it continues to see, for example, in Syria, in Iraq, in Iran, etc. So we can work together to create this this concert of civilizations, where different religions and peoples and civilizations can coexist. And Egypt is an ideal candidate for this kind of a collaborative action that India can take, because we have ourselves our own very strong civilizational links with the Arab world as a whole, and also with the Gulf and with Iran. So we can play that role. And as I mentioned, Egypt also is an African country, although it's not sub-Saharan in that sense, but it has a role there too. So these are all the reasons why we can actually make a difference.
Right.
What is the scope of trade relations between India and Egypt? Though our civilizations are we are civilizational countries and everything, developing countries in that, aspirational countries, but what do we trade between us? I mean,
the trade is growing. You're right. I mean, trade has grown. It's now $7 billion. They're expecting, or they're trying to target a growth of $12 billion. But the basket is not as big as it should be. It used to be oil, fertilizer. Egypt, for example, was exporting cotton to us. Now, one of the big items of interest to Egypt today has become wheat. And they're very keen to import wheat from India. Because of our own reasons, we had stopped the export of wheat, but they're very keen. Then there are a lot of Indian investments in Egypt. Black carbon fiber, basically based on oil and oil processing. So we can do that kind of, then we can use Egypt as a gateway to the rest of the region, including into Northern Africa and the rest of Europe, for example, and the Arab world. So there is potential for enhancing our trade, and we have competencies which Egypt wants. For example, in information technology, in cyber security, in industrial goods, in car manufacturing, automobile parts, light engineering goods, petroleum products. These are the kind of things which we can do more with Egypt. And we also, of course, have to, this depends on how fast the Egyptian economy itself grows. It's not, unfortunately, growing at a pace which is very rapid, but although they are expecting a 5% growth rate,
I think which is
this
decent.
Year, which is not bad,
decent.
which is not bad, but our exports are also a function of how much Egypt grows.
Ambassador Saran, Egypt is active in diplomacy in Africa, and we have shared interests in the region. I think it can be a win-win situation, because a lot would be at stake. If you look at the African continent, there's like 54 countries. India also hosted the India-Africa Forum Summit in 2015. So do you think this could help us in some way if we work together?
Yes, I think, I think President Sisi came here for that Indo-African summit. And, with Africa, we have a different set of problems. I mean, for example, Egypt has complicated relations with Sudan. The Nile follows through both these countries. And Egypt was very directly involved, or rather concerned, during the referendum in southern Sudan and the breakup of Sudan. Egypt also likes to play a role of a facilitator and a peacemaker in various African conflicts. So we can work with Egypt in Africa, but the problem there is that there are two other African countries who compete with Egypt for influence. One is Nigeria and the other is South Africa. And they believe that, they somehow have an equal, if not greater, say in what happens in Africa. So we have to, balance the different African powers when it comes to our outreach to Africa. So it's a little more complicated, I would say, vis-a-vis working with Egypt in the Arab world and working with Egypt in the African continent.
Ambassador Saran, interestingly, Egypt has been taking a very different position from the Gulf countries on various issues. For instance, the regime change in Syria and war in Libya. How can India benefit from Egypt's geographical position between Africa and Asia?
Egypt prides itself on its geographical location, that it stands at the crossroads of Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and Asia. But just to come back on this point about how it has reacted to these developments, in Syria or Libya. If you remember, in 2011, when we witnessed what is the Western world called the Arab Spring, right, where we saw successive Arab regimes falling and collapsing, including Hosni Mubarak. They were very upset with what was going on, and it led to a huge churning in the Arab world. And unfortunately, President Mubarak also had to leave. And but their relationship with Syria, just to also finish the thought, is interesting because at one point for a few years they were the same country. So Egypt and Syria were part of the United Arab Republic, and then they separated. So they have a very keen interest in, again, what happens in Syria, what happens in Libya, because they're all proximate. When we look at the relationship, again, as I said, between India and Egypt, the Suez Canal becomes very important as a transit route, because for us, the Indian Ocean is so important because 80 to 90% of our trade passes through the Indian Ocean. The Suez Canal is extremely critical for our own trading purposes. And we have to keep and we have to ensure that the Suez Canal remains open and available for our ships and our cargo. In addition, I think we can also actually work on the cultural side. As I said, exchange of scholars with Al-Azhar University, with the promotion of moderate Islam, with the promotion of multicultural traditions. All these are things which we can easily work much more with Egypt.
Our Defence Minister Rajnath Singh had signed an agreement with his counterpart. I think he had gone to the country and signed an agreement on defence cooperation. What does it mean? Does it mean that we are selling our wherewithal to them, or it's a two-way traffic? Does it involve more than just selling and buying of stuff, or something more than that?
This is very interesting because, defence cooperation is one area of cooperation where two countries work only when there is great trust between them. Otherwise, defence cooperation does not succeed. The first primary requirement is that you must respect each other's capabilities and trust each other, because you're sharing confidential, classified information. So it was very interesting. In September, a few months ago, our defence minister signed the agreement, and similar agreements have been signed by India with a few of the other Gulf and Arab countries. So it indicates India's willingness to move more aggressively in the defence export market. And that is an objective that has been set by the Prime Minister for the government, that you must expand your defence exports. So let us see how this works. For example, we have the Tejas light combat aircraft, we have the trainer aircraft, we have other defence hardware and platforms, which are world class, including missiles. So Egypt is a potential buyer, and traditionally, of course, Egypt has been buying basically from the Americans and from the Europeans, but now they also want to diversify. their intake from different countries. So there is potential, including for, say, localized production in Egypt of defense hardware. The role of our private sector in exporting items to Egypt is also significant. So let us see how this moves in the coming years.
Taking from there, I think we've also had exercises in the defense realm. No?
Yes, that's right. That's right. We've had exercises.
So the Egyptian ambassador to India, who's been in news for the right reasons, Mohammad Awad Hamid, has said that the forthcoming visit of the Egyptian president is being seen as an opportunity to forge a strategic relationship based on strategic priorities and interests of leaderships of the two countries. How would you interpret his remarks?
I think he's right. I mean, the fact that he's being invited as the chief guest for the Republic Day and he's the first Egyptian leader speaks for itself. And if during this visit we can revive the links that normally should have existed between India and Egypt, it'll be good. I have worked in Egypt for 3 years as a young diplomat, and I have seen that their awareness of Indian progress technologically, economically, was not as much as we would have liked it. And I remember an Egyptian delegation going to Infosys campus in Bangalore and Biocon, etc. They were completely shocked to see the kind of progress the Indian science technology complex and the industrial complex has made.
I was reading somewhere that they want to now emulate our example of digital India. They want a digital Egypt.
It is quite possible because the UPI and the India stack is becoming more and more popular in more and more countries. Mm-hmm. So a strategic relationship with Egypt is certainly possible.
Ambassador Saran, last time Indian Prime Minister visited Egypt was in 2009 for the non-aligned summit. Do you see Prime Minister Narendra Modi visiting Egypt in near future?
I think so. I mean, why not? It is, for some time what happened was there was internal instability in Egypt. Because of the events following the downfall of President Hosni Mubarak in 2011, then the internal turmoil and then the coming in of President Morsi and then his ouster, etc. There was a huge drop in the tourism earnings of Egypt, in the exports of Egypt. And, for a few years, Egypt actually had somewhat regressed in terms of its internal stability. Now, with the President Sisi having been there for this long and stability having come back and the economy also beginning to show signs of revival and Egypt also showing the readiness to play its due role both regionally and globally, I think there is a good case for our Prime Minister to visit Egypt because, as I said, we share these common interests. And most importantly is we must have a moderate global voice where civilizations are respected, religions are respected, there is no room for extremism and fundamentalism, and we both join unequivocally the fight against terrorism. And I think here we are united.
Ambassador Saran, you just told us that you've served 3 years as a career diplomat in Egypt. Why don't you please share some details of your experiences in Egypt, about people, about culture? How did you say India from their point of view?
Firstly, I think they love India. I didn't meet a single person who did not have friendly feelings towards India. They're very much like us. They're very affable, very friendly. They have a great sense of humor about themselves, about everyone else. Excellent food. I traveled a lot in the Sinai Peninsula, in the Red Sea. It's a huge country, but it's also overcrowded because 90% of the population, and it's like 100 million people, the population of Egypt has grown rapidly, and this is one of the serious threats to Egypt's stability in terms of food security, economic security, jobs, employment. But the bulk of the population lives along the river and the rest of the country is desert. It's not populated at all. So it's fertile, it's actually beautiful in terms of its landscape. So there's a huge room for travel, which I did a lot. Learning the language, as I said, is the cultural capital. All the Gulf tourists, they converge into Cairo, during the summer season to enjoy the wonderful Nile breeze, and there are these beautiful Nile cruises. There's so much of history in Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and so they are very proud people, proud of their ancestry, proud of their heritage, and great fondness for India. Arab music, it's the capital of Arab music in the Arab world. Egypt is the capital, Cairo is the capital, very similar to Indian music. So there is a lot that binds the two people.
And you got to see the Egyptian mummies also?
I did, and in fact they're so well preserved. I think the Egyptian Museum in Cairo is one of the best in the world because it has Tutankhamun, it has other kings, the temple of Hatshepsut, the Karnak, it's got so much history there. And there was a time when there's so many Indian tourists had begun to go to Egypt. But all that unfortunately stopped after the internal troubles which Egypt faced for 5, 6, 7 years. Now it's coming back to normal. And but there is a lot of empathy with India, and a lot of love for Indian movies, Indian languages, Indian culture, and there is no real ill will at all, and it's a natural constituency for us to build upon.
Have they been able to, how did they manage to contain these radicals? And they had Islamic Brotherhood who were into the political life of that country. Are there any lessons to be learned from them for us, or did they have a formula, or just it was political progression and things were by and large sorted out?
The Muslim Brotherhood actually has its roots in Cairo, in Egypt, and it's a very, very powerful movement, which was a social movement and a political movement. So the successive presidents and regimes in Cairo took a very firm line towards the Muslim Brotherhood. They ensured that they did not go beyond a point in terms of dictating how Egyptian society would function. So, for example, you would rarely see a hijab being worn. For example, in Cairo University and others, you would see young students who would be walking around freely, but that is changing now. But I think what their main focus was to, because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, because of the Palestinian refugees, thousands of them in Egypt, and because of, say, for example, the role of organizations such as the Hamas, which was a radical organization, all this poison spread into Egyptian society. So they took a very firm line, I would say, a zero tolerance line against fundamentalism, extremism, terrorism. And that is how they have been able to contain, because they wanted to maintain as much as possible the moderate, secular nature of Islam in Egypt. And by the way, they have a history of very, antagonistic relations with Iran.
Yes.
So Al-Azhar University for them became and is the beacon and the kind of the gold standard for Islamic thought and preaching and education, and they're very proud of it.
Right. So with this we come to the end of discussion of this show. Ambassador Pankaj Saran, thank you so much for your insight and perspective on our relations with Egypt.
Thank you, Atir. Thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
We'll be back soon with another edition of Around the World with Pankaj Saran soon with fresh global perspectives. Till then, goodbye, namaskar.